Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Bob Crane murder. We begin our journey in the high, dry heat of Scottsdale, Arizona. The date is June 29, 1978. Imagine the midday sun, a relentless golden orb suspended in a pale, turquoise sky. It is the kind of heat that vibrates off the asphalt in shimmering waves, blurring the edges of the stucco buildings and the tall, dusty palms that line the streets. The air is thin and tastes of sun-baked earth and sage. In 1978, Scottsdale was a quieter place, a desert oasis where the glitter of Hollywood occasionally came to rest among the cacti and the cool blue of backyard swimming pools. But on this particular Thursday afternoon, the usual serenity of the desert is about to be punctured by a silence so heavy it feels like a physical presence. This is the silence at Winfield Place, a silence that would eventually echo through the decades as one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Victoria Ann Barry, a young actress and co-star in the play titled Beginner's Luck, is driving through this intense heat. She is behind the wheel of her car, the vinyl seats warm against her skin, the air conditioner humming a low, mechanical tune that barely fights off the desert glare. She is headed toward the Winfield Place apartments, located at 7430 East Chaparral Road. There was supposed to be a luncheon, a gathering of the cast at the Safari Resort at 12:30 in the afternoon. But the star of the show, the man everyone knew as the lovable Colonel Hogan, has not appeared. Bob Crane is a man of professional habits, a man who understands the rhythm of the theater and the importance of being present. His absence is a small, nagging note of discord in the day. As Victoria turns into the complex, the tires of her car crunch softly over the gravel. The Winfield Place complex is a series of low-slung, beige buildings, modern and clean, surrounded by manicured patches of green grass that look almost surreal against the surrounding desert brown. She parks her car, the engine clicking as it begins to cool in the shade of a carport. She walks toward apartment 132. The walkway is lined with the shadows of palm fronds, dancing in the light breeze like skeletal fingers. The silence here is profound. Most residents are tucked away inside, hiding from the peak afternoon temperatures behind closed drapes and thick walls. Victoria reaches the door of the ground floor unit. She knocks, a sharp, rhythmic sound that seems to disappear into the heavy air without an answer. She knocks again, louder this time. There is no sound of movement from within, no footsteps on the carpet, no muffled voice offering a greeting. She notices a newspaper lying on the welcome mat, still wrapped in its plastic sleeve, untouched and baking in the sun. A small chill, despite the 90-degree weather, pricks at her skin. She reaches for the brass doorknob. It is warm from the heat, but as she turns it, she finds that the door is not locked. It yields with a slow, heavy creak, revealing a sliver of the dim interior. The transition from the blinding Arizona sun to the darkness of the apartment is jarring. She steps inside, the cool air of the unit washing over her like a wave of cold water. The apartment is swallowed in a deep, artificial twilight. The drapes are drawn tight, cutting off the world outside. As Victoria's eyes adjust to the gloom, she notices the smell. It is a metallic copper scent, thick and sickly sweet, hanging in the stagnant air. The living room is tidy, showing no signs of the chaos that had transpired in the dark. There are pieces of video equipment, cameras and wires, which were the tools of Bob's private passions, sitting like silent sentinels in the shadows. She calls out his name, her voice sounding thin and fragile in the large, quiet space. "Bob." There is no reply. She moves further into the apartment, her sandals making soft, rhythmic thuds on the carpet. She passes the kitchen and moves toward the master bedroom. The door is slightly ajar. The silence here is different. It is an expectant silence, a silence that feels as though it is holding its breath. She pushes the bedroom door open wider, and the smell of copper becomes overwhelming. a heavy blanket that settles in the back of her throat. The sight that meets her eyes is one of nightmare proportions. In the center of the room, on the large bed, lies a figure. At first, in the dim light, Victoria thinks she is seeing a woman with long, dark hair. But as she moves closer, the horrific reality begins to crystallize. The dark mass is not hair, it is blood, oxidized and thick, covering the pillow and the head of the man lying there. It is Bob Crane. He is lying on his side, his body curled into a gentle, fetal position, as if he were merely caught in a deep, peaceful sleep. He is shirtless, his skin pale against the dark, crimson stains that have sprayed across the headboard and reached up toward the ceiling in a violent, abstract pattern. Around his neck, a black electrical cord has been wound and tied, a macabre necklace that contrasts sharply with the stillness of his frame. The room is a theater of the grotesque, a sudden and brutal end for a man who spent his life making the world laugh. Victoria stands frozen, the shock radiating through her body like an electric current. The scream that finally tears from her throat is the only sound in the apartment, a sharp, jagged edge that finally breaks the silence of Winfield Place. She stumbles back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The transition from the vibrant, living world of the Scottsdale sun to this cold, dark chamber of death is too much to process. She finds the telephone, her fingers trembling so violently she can hardly grip the receiver. The police are called, and soon the quiet courtyard of Winfield Place will be flooded with the blue and red flashes of emergency lights and the frantic energy of an investigation. But for these few moments, before the sirens arrive, there is only the heavy, copper air and the stillness of apartment 132. The investigation would eventually reveal that Bob had been struck twice on the left side of his head with a heavy, blunt object, likely a camera tripod, while he lay sleeping. The killer had vanished into the desert night, leaving behind no signs of forced entry and no missing valuables. As the first officers arrive and begin to tape off the scene, the sun continues its slow descent over the mountains, oblivious to the tragedy that has just been unmasked. The story of Bob Crane has shifted from the bright lights of the television screen to the dark, grainy reality of a cold case that would haunt the valley for 40 years. Rest now as the sun sets over the desert and let the details of the afternoon fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. The Scottsdale sun in late June of 1978 was more than just heat. It was a physical presence that pressed against the stucco walls of the Winfield Place apartments, a dry, baking weight that seemed to slow time itself. Outside, the air shimmered over the asphalt, distorting the horizon where the desert met the sprawling suburbs. This was the backdrop for Bob Crane's final act. To the vacationers and theater-goers, he was still the charismatic Colonel Hogan, the man with the quick-witted grin and the infectious energy that had defined one of television's most beloved comedies. But the reality of 1978 was far more fragile. The bright lights of Hollywood had dimmed, replaced by the flickering neon of the dinner theater circuit. He was touring with a play called Beginner's Luck, a title that felt increasingly ironic as the years passed. In the quiet moments between the matinee and the evening show, the applause felt thinner, and the grease paint in the dressing room mirror seemed to settle into deeper lines on a face that was nearing its 50th year. The world of dinner theater was a strange, twilight existence, a cycle of medium-rare steaks, clinking silverware, and the polite laughter of audiences who wanted to see the man they remembered from their living rooms a decade prior. It was a life lived in suitcases and rented apartments, a nomadic existence that required a specific kind of companionship to stave off the encroaching silence of the road. That companionship arrived in the form of John Henry Carpenter. If Bob was the light, the performer who basked in the gaze of the public, John was the technician of the shadows. They had met years earlier, back in the mid-1960s, introduced by Richard Dawson on the bustling set of Hogan's Heroes. John wasn't an actor. He was a man who understood the language of wires, reels, and the emerging miracles of magnetic tape. As a regional sales manager for Sony, and later Akai, Carpenter was a gatekeeper to a new kind of power. In an era when most of the world still relied on still photography and heavy film projectors, John carried the future in his briefcase. He was the one who could provide the latest video recording equipment, bulky, expensive machines like the Sony Portapack that allowed a man to capture life in motion and play it back instantly. For Bob, a man obsessed with the visual and the rhythmic, this technology was more than a gadget. It was a revelation. Their friendship was forged in the hum of electronics and the shared thrill of the hunt. John would often arrange his business travel to mirror Bob's touring schedule, ensuring that wherever the theater circuit took crane, the video equipment, and the man who knew how to operate it was never far behind. They became a team, a two-man operation that navigated the nightlife of every city they visited, with John often introduced as Bob's manager, a title that provided a thin veil of professional legitimacy to their nocturnal activities. Behind the closed doors of various hotel rooms and apartment rentals, the double life took shape. The ritual was consistent. The celebrity of Bob Crane acted as the lure, drawing women into their orbit, while the technical expertise of John Carpenter provided the means to document what followed. The air in those rooms would grow heavy with the scent of cigarettes and the ozone smell of warming electronics. There was a specific, tactile quality to the equipment of the 1970s. The heavy click of the unwind tapes sliding into the deck, the mechanical whir of the reels spinning, and the soft, flickering glow of the monitors that cast long, distorted shadows against the walls. They weren't just living their lives. They were recording them, creating a private library of encounters that blurred the lines between reality and performance. For Bob, the camera was an extension of his own drumming, a way to capture a beat, a moment of intensity, and hold onto it forever. But for those looking in from the outside later, the tapes told a more complicated story. Some women would later claim they had no idea the red light of the camera was glowing in the corner of the room, while others were part of the shared theater. It was a compulsive, high-stakes game played in the margins of a fading career, a secret world that bound the two men together in a way that was becoming increasingly suffocating. By the time they reached Scottsdale in June of 1978, the friction between them had begun to generate its own heat. The relationship was no longer the simple partnership of earlier years. To some observers, John Carpenter had become a hanger-on, a man whose own identity seemed to have been swallowed by the reflected glow of Bob's celebrity. Bob was nearing 50, and something within him was shifting. He spoke to his son about making changes, about a clean slate. He was going through a second divorce, and the frantic pace of the double life was beginning to lose its luster. He wanted to distance himself from the very things that John Carpenter represented, the tapes, the technology, and the relentless pursuit of the next recording. Friends noticed a change in the atmosphere when the two were together. The easy banter had been replaced by a sharp, underlying tension. John, sensing the withdrawal, seemed to lean in harder, his presence becoming more persistent, more demanding. He was the man who had provided the tools for Bob's private world, and the idea of being discarded was a bitter pill to swallow. In the dry Arizona air, the bond that had once been built on shared secrets was now a chain that both men were beginning to strain against. The final days were a blur of mundane professional duties and late-night confrontations. On the evening of June 28, 1978, Bob performed his role in Beginner's Luck at the Windmill Dinner Theater. He was professional, charming, and spent time after the show shaking hands with fans, even promising a young boy an autographed photo the following day. But after the curtain fell and the theater lights dimmed, the shadows returned. He met John at the Safari Resort, a local landmark where the coffee shop served as a late-night sanctuary for the restless. They were seen together at 2:30 in the morning, two men hunched over a table in a pool of artificial light while the rest of Scottsdale slept. Eyewitnesses would later describe an argument, a moment of visible discord that punctured the quiet of the early morning hours. When they finally parted ways, the desert night was at its stillest, a deep, indigo silence that settled over the Winfield Place apartments. Bob returned to room 132A, perhaps thinking of the changes he would make when the sun rose. He had told friends he was going to end the friendship for good. He was looking for a way out, a way to leave the double life behind and step back into the light. But as he closed his eyes that night, the technology he had loved so much, the heavy tripods, the electrical cords, the tools of the trade, was still there, waiting in the dark. The morning of June 29, 1978, arrived with a relentless, dry heat that seemed to bake the very air over Scottsdale. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had climbed to a staggering 104 degrees, turning the asphalt of the Winfield Place apartments into a shimmering, distorted mirror. The complex was usually a quiet sanctuary for snowbirds and travelers, a cluster of sun-bleached walls and turquoise swimming pools. At 2 in the afternoon, Victoria Barry, a young actress and co-star in the play, arrived at apartment 132 Alpha. She was there for a routine work session, a simple matter of dubbing dialogue, but as she approached the door, a small detail broke the rhythm of the day. The morning newspaper still lay on the concrete walkway, untouched and yellowing under the fierce sun. It was a silent witness to a morning that had never truly begun for the man inside. When she reached for the handle, she expected the resistance of a locked door, but the brass knob turned with a hollow click. The door was unlocked, a rare lapse in security for a man who, despite his chaotic lifestyle, was often fastidious about his privacy. The transition from the blinding desert glare to the interior of the apartment was jarring. Inside, the drapes were drawn tight, plunging the living room into a heavy, artificial twilight. The cool air from the hum of the air conditioning carried a scent that Victoria couldn't immediately place, a metallic, copper-like tang that felt thick in the back of her throat. She moved through the shadows of the living room, passing the familiar clutter of video cameras, heavy recording decks, and a tangle of black power cables that snaked across the beige carpet like sleeping vines. She called out his name, her voice small and tentative in the vast silence of the suite. There was no answer, only the steady, rhythmic drone of the cooling system. She followed the narrow hallway toward the master bedroom, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. The door was slightly ajar, casting a sliver of darkness onto the floor. When she pushed it open, the air grew colder and the silence deeper. On the bed, amidst a sea of white linens that had been violently rearranged, lay the silhouette of a man who had once been the most recognizable face on television. The violence of the scene was a sharp, jagged contrast to the charming persona of the man who lay there. He was shirtless, his body curled slightly as if he had been interrupted in the middle of a deep, dreamless sleep. The left side of his face was a ruin of shadows and trauma, the result of at least 2 crushing blows from a heavy, blunt object. But the most chilling detail was a dark electrical cord, knotted tightly around his neck in a macabre bow, its plastic insulation gleaming faintly in the low light. Blood had sprayed in a frantic, mist-like pattern across the headboard and the pale walls, and a dark, spreading stain had claimed the majority of the pillow. A trail of crimson droplets led away from the bed, marking a path across the carpet toward the front door, the exit route of a killer who had moved through the dark with terrifying purpose. Panicked, Victoria fled the apartment, her screams finally breaking the heavy stillness of the complex. Soon, the quiet cul-de-sac was flooded with the spinning blue and red lights of the Scottsdale Police Department, but the investigation was born into a state of unintended chaos. In 1978, Scottsdale was a town of leisure, and its police force was more accustomed to resolving property disputes than processing high-profile celebrity homicides. They had no dedicated homicide division at the time, and the inexperience showed in the frantic first hours of the investigation. The crime scene, which should have been a pristine vault of evidence, quickly became a crossroads of contamination. Officers and technicians trooped in and out of the narrow bedroom, their heavy boots potentially crushing microscopic clues into the fibers of the rug. In one of the most glaring lapses, Victoria Barry was permitted to answer the ringing telephone inside the apartment, her hands touching the very surfaces that might have held the killer's fingerprints. Evidence was reportedly gathered with a lack of rigor that would later haunt the case. Various items were placed together in a single large garbage bag, allowing for the possibility of cross-contamination. Outside, the perimeter was soft. Moving men working in a nearby unit were not immediately questioned, and the business manager of the victim was eventually allowed to remove personal items from the scene before every corner had been meticulously dusted for prints. As the investigators began the grim task of cataloging the room, their focus turned to what was missing. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer was someone who held a key or had been invited in under the cover of night. Nothing of obvious value had been stolen. His watch remained, and his wallet was untouched. The search for the murder weapon, however, proved fruitlessly elusive. Based on the nature of the wounds and the victim's well-known obsession with new technology, detectives began to suspect a heavy, professional-grade camera tripod. They searched the apartment, the dumpsters, and the surrounding desert scrub, but the heavy instrument had vanished as if swallowed by the heat. Their attention soon pivoted to the victim's social circle, specifically a man named John Carpenter, who had been seen with him just hours before the estimated time of death. When they located the rental car Carpenter had been driving, a white sedan, they found what appeared to be the first thread of a crumbling sweater. Small smears of blood were discovered on the interior door panel. It was type B, a relatively rare blood type shared by only 10% of the population. It was the same type as the man in apartment 132 Alpha, but in a pre-DNA era, this was a shadow of proof rather than a conviction, and the physical evidence of the case was already beginning to fade like a desert mirage. The hot, dry air of Scottsdale began to swallow the memory of that June morning, as the years stretched out like long shadows across the desert floor. At the Winfield Place apartments, the blue water of the swimming pool continued to shimmer under the relentless Arizona sun, and the footsteps of new residents eventually muffled the echoes of the investigation. 14 summers came and went, each one baking the asphalt and bleaching the memories of those who had lived through the initial shock. The case files, once crisp and white, began to take on a yellowed, brittle quality, resting in heavy manila folders inside metal cabinets that smelled of stale paper and cold iron. Outside, the world was changing. The 1970s bled into the neon-soaked 80s, and the star power of the man found in apartment 132 Alpha began to fade into the soft, flickering glow of late-night television reruns. Yet, for those tasked with finding justice, the silence was not a sign of peace, but a heavy, suffocating weight that refused to lift. Lieutenant Ron Dean could often be found in the quiet of his office, the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock serving as a metronome for his persistent thoughts. He would frequently find himself returning to the crime scene in his mind, visualizing the placement of every cord and the exact angle of the blood spatter on the beige walls. The image of the missing camera tripod haunted him, a phantom object that he felt certain held the key to the entire mystery. He remembered the weight of the telephone in his hand when John Carpenter had called the apartment on that first day, and the unsettling, hollow tone of a man who didn't ask why the police were answering his friend's phone. To Dean, the suspicion was a physical sensation, like a burr caught in a wool sweater, constant and irritating. He knew that the evidence they had gathered in those first few days, the blood smears in the rental car that matched the victim's rare type, was a tantalizing thread, but the prosecutors had deemed it too thin to weave into a noose. The legal system required more than just the echoes of an argument and a few drops of iron-scented proof. Hundreds of miles away, in the coastal humidity of Torrance, California, John Carpenter moved through his life like a man walking through a thick fog. He had returned to his world of high-end electronics, surrounding himself with the low hum of cooling fans and the glowing green lights of specialized equipment. He worked as a service manager, his hands familiar with the intricate copper veins of circuit boards and the steady pulse of technology. To his colleagues, he was a man of routine, though some noted the way his once famous jet-black hair was slowly yielding to streaks of salt and pepper. He lived in a quiet, blue-collar neighborhood, far from the bright lights and the velvet-lined booths of the Scottsdale nightclubs. Yet, the shadow of the desert followed him. He reportedly refused to even fly over the state of Arizona, as if the very soil of that place held a magnetic pull he could not risk. He maintained a life of relative obscurity, a quiet existence built on the foundation of a case that had officially gone cold, though the investigators in Scottsdale never truly stopped looking in his direction. The turning point arrived in 1990, carried on the wings of a new decade and the fresh eyes of investigators Barry Vassall and Jim Raines. They stepped into the evidence storage room, a space where the air was thick with the scent of cedar and the peculiar metallic tang of aging forensic kits. Under the harsh, flickering hum of fluorescent lights, they began the painstaking process of re-examining every photograph and every scrap of paper. It was a search for something missed, a tiny detail that might have been overlooked in the frantic energy of 1978. Raines moved through the boxes with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his fingers tracing the edges of the evidence bags. He was looking for a bridge between the past and the present, something that the burgeoning field of genetic testing could finally claim as definitive. In a quiet corner of a storage shelf, tucked away like a forgotten memory, they found a series of photographs that had never been fully scrutinized. The images were glossy and cool to the touch, capturing the interior of the rental car in vivid, unblinking detail. As Raines peered through a magnifying glass at one particular color photograph, the world seemed to narrow down to a single, microscopic point. There, on the interior panel of the passenger door, was a tiny, reddish-brown speck. In the original investigation, it had been noted merely as a smear, but in the high-resolution clarity of the photograph, it looked different. It looked like a minute fragment of human tissue. The realization sent a chill through the quiet room. Though the actual physical sample had long since vanished into the bureaucratic labyrinth of evidence handling, the photograph remained as a silent witness. It was a visual ghost of the crime, a biological signature that the investigators believed had flown off the murder weapon during the struggle. This small, grainy image became the catalyst the department had been waiting for. They believed this speck, combined with the rare blood type found in the car, created a path that led directly back to John Carpenter. The air in the station felt electric, charged with the sudden, sharp possibility that the long interval of silence was finally coming to an end. In June of 1992, the desert heat was just beginning to intensify when the decision was finally made. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office reviewed the findings, weighing the weight of a single photograph against the decade of suspicion. The order was signed, and the wheels of justice, which had been rusted shut for 14 years, began to turn with a heavy, grinding sound. When the authorities arrived to take John Carpenter into custody, the moment was stripped of Hollywood drama. It was a somber, quiet conclusion to a long wait. He was 63 years old now, his face lined with the passage of time and the weight of the accusations that had never truly left him. As the steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound echoed in the quiet California air, a sharp punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. He was flown back across the border he had avoided for so long, returning to the harsh, bright light of Arizona to face a charge of first-degree murder. The long interval was over, and the trial that would mesmerize a nation was about to begin in the shadow of the mountains. The year was 1994, and the desert sun of Arizona was a relentless, shimmering presence that baked the streets of Phoenix until the asphalt softened under the weight of the city. Inside the Maricopa County Courthouse, however, the air was held in a cold, artificial stillness. The courtroom felt like a sanctuary of marble and heavy oak, a place where time was measured not by the movement of the sun, but by the slow, rhythmic turning of pages in a legal brief. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of floor wax and the faint, metallic tang of the air conditioning system that labored against the outside heat. John Henry Carpenter sat at the defense table, a man who seemed to have aged a lifetime in the 16 years since the tragedy in Scottsdale. His once dark hair was now a thin, translucent white, and his skin held the pallor of a man who had spent too many hours under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. He adjusted his glasses with a hand that carried a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor, his eyes fixed on the empty space before him. Across the aisle, the 12 men and women of the jury, the 12 peers of the desert, sat in their high-backed wooden chairs. The grain of the wood was worn smooth by the hundreds of hands that had rested there before them. They were a cross-section of the valley, their faces unreadable, their postures stiff as they prepared to listen to a story that was as much a ghost story as it was a criminal trial. The silence in the room was a heavy, living thing, broken only by the occasional, muffled cough or the soft, rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's stenograph machine, recording every breath and every syllable for the archives of the state. The prosecution began their presentation with the slow, deliberate movement of a predator closing in on its prey. They dimmed the lights, plunging the courtroom into a hazy, violet-tinted gloom that made the dust motes dance like tiny, glowing spirits in the beams of the overhead projector. On the large, white screen at the front of the room, an image appeared, a grainy, magnified photograph of the interior passenger door of a rental car from 1978. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes squinting against the glare. The prosecutor pointed to a tiny, dark speck, a minute blemish against the textured gray of the door panel. His voice was a low, steady rumble as he described this speck as more than just a stain. He called it a biological signature, a fragment of fatty tissue that he claimed had been flung from the head of Bob Crane during the final, violent moments of his life. The room felt suddenly colder as the implications of that tiny dot settled over the audience. The projector whirred with a soft, mechanical drone, the sound of an older technology trying to speak to a new era. The image was soft around the edges, the resolution lacking the crystalline clarity of modern digital photography. It was a shadow of a shadow, a captured moment of horror that had been hidden in an evidence folder for over a decade and a half. The jurors looked at the speck, then at the defendant, then back at the screen, trying to see the truth in the blurred landscape of the photograph. As the defense began their counterargument, the air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavy with the scent of old paper and the realization of a profound absence. The lead defense attorney stood slowly, his footsteps muffled by the thick, industrial carpet. He spoke not of what the prosecution had found, but of what they had lost. He revealed to the jury that the physical speck of tissue, the actual biological matter that the prosecution so confidently identified, was no longer in the possession of the state. It had been consumed by the rudimentary tests performed in the late 70s, or perhaps it had simply vanished into the void of a mismanaged evidence locker during the 16 years of the case's long slumber. There was no tissue to re-examine, no sample to subject to the emerging marvels of DNA profiling. All that remained was the photograph, a static representation of a ghost. The defense highlighted the type B blood found in the car, explaining with a slow, patient cadence that while it matched the victim, It was a common blood type shared by millions. In the 1990s, the world was waking up to the absolute certainty of genetic mapping, but this trial was forced to rely on the crumbling remnants of the past. The expert witnesses spoke of degradation and contamination, their words falling like heavy stones into the quiet room. They described how the desert heat and the passage of years could unravel the very fabric of evidence until only doubt remained. The defense moved through the courtroom like a weaver, unspooling the prosecution's narrative thread by thread, until the smoking gun looked more like a smudge of charcoal on a distant horizon. The trial stretched on for 8 long weeks, a marathon of memory and technicality that left everyone in the room exhausted. As the time for deliberation approached, the 12 peers were led into a small, windowless room, the heavy door clicking shut behind them with a finality that echoed in the hallway. The room was illuminated by a single, buzzing light fixture that cast long, distorted shadows across the table. On that table sat a mountain of evidence. The grainy photos, the transcripts of testimony from witnesses whose memories had been clouded by the fog of 16 winters, and the diagrams of a motel room that no longer looked as it did in the summer of 1978. The jurors sat in the uncomfortable, vinyl-padded chairs, the silence between them filled by the sound of the building's ventilation system. They spoke of the camera tripod, a weapon that had never been recovered, a phantom object that the prosecution claimed was the instrument of death. They debated the meaning of a photograph when the object it depicted was gone. The air in the deliberation room was stale, tasting of cold coffee and the immense responsibility of their task. They were the 12 peers in the desert, huddling together to find a path through a landscape of reasonable doubt. Each time they looked at the evidence, the edges seemed to fray a little more. The weight of reasonable doubt sat on their shoulders like a physical burden, a pressure that grew with every hour they spent in that small, humming room. They were searching for a certainty that the passage of time had stolen, leaving them only with the echoes of a tragedy and the haunting image of a single, lost speck in the dark. The echo of the gavel in June of 1994 did not sound like a resolution. Instead, it was a hollow, wooden thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the Maricopa County Superior Court, leaving a thick, unsettled silence in its wake. When the jury foreman read the words "not guilty," the air in the room didn't lighten. It became heavy, laden with the weight of questions that had no place to go. John Carpenter sat at the defense table, his shoulders finally dropping from a height they had held for 2 long years of legal battle. Outside, the Arizona sun was a blinding, oppressive force, baking the pavement and shimmering in the distance like a lake that wasn't really there. The crowds dispersed, the cameras were packed away into dark leather cases, and the lawyers straightened their ties. But for those who had lived within the shadow of the Bob Crane mystery for 16 years, the acquittal felt less like an ending and more like a long, slow fade into the fog. The courtroom floor, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the flickering overhead lights as the janitors began their slow, rhythmic sweeping, brushing away the dust of a trial that had promised a final answer and delivered only a void. John Carpenter returned to his life, but the world he re-entered was not the one he had left. He moved through the streets of Torrance, California, like a ghost in his own narrative. The suspicion followed him, a faint, metallic scent that never quite washed off, no matter how many times the legal system declared him free. He had lost his career at the electronics firm, his reputation was a tattered fabric that could not be mended, and his health began to quietly, steadily unravel. For 4 years, he lived in the quiet periphery of the public eye, a man known primarily for the friend he was accused of killing. In September of 1998, at the age of 70, John Carpenter passed away. He died maintaining his innocence, taking whatever secrets he held into the earth with him. With his death, the legal path to the truth seemed to crumble into dust. The files in the Scottsdale Police Department grew yellow and brittle in their cardboard boxes, stacked on metal shelves where the air was still and smelled of old paper and forgotten intentions. The case was technically cold, but the memory of Bob Crane remained a flickering, restless flame in the minds of those who could not let the silence have the last word. Nearly 4 decades passed, and the world transformed. The bulky video recorders and magnetic tapes that had once defined the friendship of Crane and Carpenter became relics of a primitive age, replaced by the silent, invisible flow of digital data. In 2016, a seasoned television reporter named John Hook stood in the climate-controlled silence of the evidence room, looking at the boxes that contained the fragments of a life cut short. With the permission of the authorities and the weary blessing of Bob Crane's son, he sought to use the miracle of modern science to look where the eyes of 1978 could not see. He reached out to the blood samples, the tiny, preserved droplets that had once been the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against Carpenter. The vials were small, cold to the touch, and held within them the microscopic blueprints of a tragedy. The lab was a world of sterile white surfaces and the low, constant hum of machines that could pull a single strand of identity from a sea of degradation. The air there was crisp and clinical, devoid of the emotion that had fueled the trial decades earlier. Everyone expected the machines to finally speak the name that the jury could not. When the results arrived in November of 2016, they did not bring the closure that everyone had craved. Instead, they brought a bombshell that shook the very foundation of what people thought they knew. The blood found on the door of John Carpenter's rental car, the evidence that had been used to place him at the scene of the crime for 38 years, was not Bob Crane's. The DNA profiles extracted from those ancient stains revealed a terrifying new complexity. One sequence belonged to an unknown male, a shadow figure whose identity was not in any database, a phantom who had walked through the Scottsdale night and left a trace that only became visible when it was too late to follow. The second profile was too degraded, a whisper of a code that had been eaten away by time and the desert heat until it was nothing more than a broken sentence. The news was met with a stunned, heavy silence. If the blood wasn't Bob's, the entire architecture of the case against Carpenter shifted. It didn't prove his innocence, but it cast a long, dark shadow over the certainty of his guilt. The mystery didn't solve itself. It grew deeper, more tangled, like a garden left to the briars for 40 years. The revelation left Bob's family in a state of quiet shock. The closure they had hoped for had vanished, replaced by the realization that the truth might be something that can never be fully grasped. We are left with the image of an apartment on Chaparral Road, the soft hum of an air conditioner fighting the Arizona heat, and a man who lived his life in the spotlight only to vanish in the darkest of shadows. The tripod, the electrical cord, the missing friend, the unknown DNA, they are all pieces of a puzzle that no longer fits together. Perhaps the answers have simply evaporated into the dry desert air, carried away by the wind that rattles the palm fronds at night. Bob Crane remains a frozen figure in our cultural memory, forever 49 years old, forever the smiling hero behind the barbed wire of a fictional camp, while the real-life walls around his death remain unclimbed. The story has reached the end of its telling, leaving us only with the soft, grainy flicker of an old television screen before it fades to black. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.